I would like to change the topic and talk to you a little bit about the cluster of excellence, Multiscale Bioimaging, that is here in Göttingen, and it's studying the brain and the heart. And you as a spokesperson and we as a student associated with this cluster, we are happy to have this kind of organization in Göttingen. And I would like to invite you and ask you now to maybe explain to our listeners what is this cluster doing, and why is it important to have it in Göttingen, for example?
Yeah, no, that's great. I thanks also for your impression of it. I think just for those of you who haven't heard about clusters of excellence, you might want to know that science in general, is covered in part by the institutions where professors, group leaders, students, postdocs, etc., work in groups to make things happen. And so, on top of such institutional support, there's various ways of funding research in countries that afford funding research. And so, I could be filing an application for a project that I think is really relevant and important science, and then I would address a funding agency to hopefully approve that, and it will be reviewed by peers, and they will basically then also have to say whether the funding I requested is reasonable, and eventually this might be there to, for example, finance the salary of a PhD student, and some money for consumables that the student would be using, all embedded in good environment where things happen. So that's like a small scale funding, very important, however. And then basically many of the things we've been talking about are not sufficiently covered by the work of an individual. And this is different from, the different areas of science. So in humanities, for example, it might be really that you can make a difference with sort of the way you investigate and think and this basically derive a concept. You may still talk to people about it before you phrase it, but you might write a book and that's it. But in the life science and biomedical research, but also in the natural science, if you think for particle physics, for example, it's becoming more and more clear that you need collaborative efforts to really address questions from different angles with different disciplines. And, this is something where then research funding also has been provided, and we have collaborative research centers in the German funding landscape that are fantastic in kind of working for supporting the group of scientists and their teams to work on a particular aspect that is, innovative, interesting, and relevant. And then beyond that, the German government came up with the scheme of the Excellence Initiative, or then strategy, and this has been supporting the structured training of PhD students, for example, in the first terms, and then the clusters of excellence, which you can think of larger scale collaborative research centers. Oftentimes they are more like an umbrella on top of collaborative research centers and institutional research activities. And that's really what this MBExC, the Multiscale Bioimaging cluster, is. It tries to develop methods that allow us to address, biological process of relevance for excitable cells in our heart and in our nervous system, from the molecular scale all the way to the organ scale. And, that's actually a huge challenge and quite ambitious plan. But because we have very strong methods development in Göttingen, since the patch clamp, the magnetic resonance imaging, and super resolution microscopy, Göttingen is one of the places where it's actually possible to develop new stuff that actually would power such biomedical research. And then why heart and brain? It's already said, because of excitable cells. They have, comparable needs, say in energy generation, in terms of dealing with proteins because they are long-living cells, so they need to keep proteins in check. And they also need ion channels, and they also need calcium-triggered membrane fusion. And so we have identified areas that are relevant to both the cardiomyocytes, the cells of the heart, and the neurons, the sensory cells of the nervous system, where Göttingen researchers really have a very strong foundation of work already. And then we have basically applied for this grant for us to really build this into a full-fledged research program and training structure. And so, I mean, you probably realize that I'm quite passionate about it, but it has allowed us to actually close gaps, say, between the molecular scale and the cellular scale by recruiting people who really have the methodological competence to bridge these scales. And now the same applies to the scales between cells, the gap between cells and networks, where again we recruited fantastic colleagues to Göttingen to help us bridge the scale. And we have started to also, train scientists that would either be brought up in the natural science or in the medical science in the classical, conventional training activities in the Hertha Spooner College, where really the sort of, transdisciplinary training is key. And so I think together with this training and bringing up people who actually are competent in, also transiting from one world to the other world, and from working between the disciplines, between theory and experiment, and with really taking this broadest view, not just focusing on one scale, but really thinking of what a defect in a machinery like a synapse we've been talking means for hearing, right? We have basically made quite some good progress, and we're just preparing now for a renewal of this entire cluster of excellence.
I really hope that it's going to be renewed, and I think, and I am actually convinced that, but let's not say anything before the final revisions.